It was actually probably the happiest year of my life, that year of German occupation. For me, it was a very positive experience. It's a strange thing, because you see incredible suffering around you, and in fact, you're in considerable danger yourself. But you're 14 years old and you don't believe that it can actually touch you. You have a belief in yourself, your belief in your father. It's a very happy-making, exhilarating experience.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes, yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right. Yes.
I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all.
Of all the financial titans and philanthropists of the 20th century, none are more complex or mysterious than George Soros. Like Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and the Rockefellers, he amassed billions through ruthless business decisions, only to turn around and give away most of his fortune to advance his own personal philosophy. He can move world financial markets simply by voicing an opinion, or destabilize a government by buying and selling its currency. He also pledged more aid last year to help people in Russia than the U.S. government did. But now George Soros is worried. He thinks the global economy is coming apart at the seams, and that the world needs to be protected from people like George Soros.
We may now think that everything is fine, but the fact is that the system is broke and it needs fixing.
What you're doing is asking some form of regulation to protect the world against you.
Well, I am a player, and I think all players should be regulated. There have to be rules of the game.
Take 81,000 to buy. Buy 48,000. Buy him 69,000 YUM.
Right now, his Quantum Group hedge fund moves $14 billion of rich investors' money around the world every day, looking for profits and answering to no one. Soros makes huge bets on whole countries and economies. Last year, when he saw cracks in the Asia boom, he began selling the currency in Thailand. Traders in Hong Kong followed suit, triggering a financial crisis that plunged much of Asia into a depression.
In the last 2 years, you've been blamed for financial collapse of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia.
Yeah, all of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Are you that powerful?
No, I think there's a great misunderstanding.
The Prime Minister of Malaysia said that the region spent 40 years trying to build up its economy, and along comes a moron like Soros with a lot of money, and it's all over. He called you a criminal.
It's easier for him to blame an outside force than to admit that they were mismanaging their economy and their currency. The French finance minister talked about hanging speculators from lampposts.
Soros says the Asian currencies would have collapsed even if he hadn't been in the market. They were overvalued. He says people tend to follow his lead because he's been so successful.
I think that I've been blamed for everything. I am basically there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do.
This man is a carnivore of the first order.
Jim Grant is the editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer and one of Wall Street's most respected analysts. He never tires of watching Soros, in part because of the huge bets he's willing to place on his hunches.
He has always amazed the people he's worked with at his audacity and his willingness to back up his commitments with enormous sums of money. It causes the blood to drain from ordinary mortals' faces.
Like risking $2 billion in Russia. When the Russian market began falling apart in August, Soros was the country's single largest investor. He called the U.S. Treasury and asked Uncle Sam for $7 billion to prop up the ruble. When U.S. officials failed to intervene, Soros wrote a letter to the Financial Times of London saying he thought the Russian currency should be devalued by as much as 25%. A few words from Soros were enough to cause panic selling that fueled the crash.
What's it like to have a statement that you make have such serious, grievous consequences? I mean, you can, it looks to me like in a number of situations you can take a position against a currency or make a statement, and the whole country falls apart.
Well, it's a tremendous sense of responsibility, actually. And it's also a humbling experience because I am actually trying to do the right thing, and sometimes what I do has an unintended negative consequence, as it did in Russia.
For both the Russian middle class and for Soros, who lost his $2 billion. Whatever his motivations, no one can accuse him of greed. He's backed away from the day-to-day operation of his businesses and is giving away his billions now with the same determination that he made them in places like Haiti, a country that has less money in the bank than he does. Last month, he brought the First Lady with him for a look at some of the projects his foundation is funding.
This is Mr. George Soros, and he's going to be helping the hospital.
This year, Soros plans to give away almost $500 million around the world. In Bosnia, when the water supply to Sarajevo was cut off at the height of the siege, it was Soros who wrote a check to jury-rig a pipeline through an abandoned highway tunnel.
$5 million up front can be more valuable than $50 million a year or two later.
Ambassador Richard Holbrooke brokered the peace in Bosnia.
At one point, after the Dayton peace agreements in Bosnia in 1995, for a considerable period of time, George had given more money to implement the peace agreements than the U.S. government had. He just could move that fast.
In Russia, he pledged $100 million to help scientists who might otherwise have sold their expertise to bidders like Iran or Iraq. In Eastern Europe, he's educated a new generation. And in Ukraine, he spent millions retraining the old Soviet military.
At the center of George Soros, there's an inherent contradiction.
Which is?
Which is, on one hand, you're the capitalist who does not care about the social consequences of his act, and on the other hand, you are a philanthropist who cares only about social consequences. How do you resolve the two?
Recognizing that as a competitor, I've got to compete to win. As a human being, I am concerned about the society in which I live.
Which George Soros am I talking to now? The amoral George Soros or the moral George Soros?
It's one person. It's one person who at one time engages in amoral activities and at the rest of the time tries to be moral.
To understand the complexities and contradictions in his personality, you have to go back to the very beginning, to Budapest, where George Soros was born 68 years ago to parents who were wealthy, well-educated, and Jewish. When the Nazis occupied Budapest in 1944, George Soros' father was a successful lawyer. He lived on an island in the Danube and liked to commute to work in a rowboat. But knowing there were problems ahead for the Jews, he decided to split his family up. He bought them forged papers, and he bribed a government official to take 14-year-old George Soros in and swear that he was his Christian godson. But survival carried a heavy price tag. While hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were being shipped off to the death camps, George Soros accompanied his phony godfather on his appointed rounds, confiscating property from the Jews. These are pictures from 1944 of what happened to George Soros' friends and neighbors.
You're a Hungarian Jew who escaped the Holocaust by posing as a Christian.
Right.
And you watched lots of people get shipped off to the death camps.
Right. I was 14 years old. And I would say that that's when my character was made.
In what way?
That one should think ahead, one should understand and anticipate events, and one is threatened. It was a tremendous threat of evil. I mean, it was a very personal experience of evil.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes, yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right. Yes.
I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all. Maybe as a child you don't see the connection, but it created no problem at all.
No feeling of guilt.
No.
For example, that I'm Jewish, and here I am watching these people go. I could just as easily be there. I should be there. None of that.
Well, of course, I could be on the other side, or I could be the one from whom the thing is being taken away. But there was no sense that I shouldn't be there, because that was, well, actually, funny way, it's just like in markets, that if I weren't there, of course I wasn't doing it, but somebody else would be taking it away anyhow. In other words, whether I was there or not, I was only a spectator, the property was being taken away. So I had no role in taking away that property. So I had no sense of guilt.
Are you religious?
No.
Do you believe in God?
No.
Soros told us he believes God was created by man, not the other way around, which may be why he thinks he can smooth out the world's imperfections. When we went with him to Ukraine, he was treated like a visiting head of state and was received by the president. Then he was received by the prime minister and finally the central bank.
20% in cash.
They even allowed him to look at the books and asked him for advice. Lots of people want George Soros' advice. Most recently, South African President Nelson Mandela.
Actually, President Mandela asked me, how could South Africa protect itself against speculators like you? And I told him, I wrote him a memo, trying to give him the best advice I could, how to reduce the exposure of South Africa to speculative attack.
That's the old stop me before I kill again approach, right?
Well,
you're telling this is what you can do to stop me.
Whether I or somebody else does whatever is happening in the markets, it really doesn't make any difference to the outcome. I don't feel guilty because I'm engaged in an amoral activity which is not meant to have anything to do with guilt.
Part of the reason he is so rich is that the Soros hedge funds operate offshore in the Netherlands Antilles to avoid scrutiny by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So even while Soros tells Congress and the Treasury that hedge funds must be regulated to stop the global crisis, he's avoiding the rules.
Why is it that Americans can't invest in the quantum fund? It's an offshore fund. Why is that?
Because the fund is not registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We are not
licensed to do business in the United States.
That's right.
Because?
Because we are not registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Because we find it more convenient to operate without it.
So in some ways it's to escape regulation.
Yeah, that's right.
But you've been sitting here talking about the need for regulation.
Yes, and whatever regulations are imposed, we will obey. We already conform to everything.
If the beneficiaries of Soros's billions do not understand the intricacies of SEC rules and offshore hedge funds, they do understand what he's done for them. The president of Haiti is reading his new book, The Crisis of Global Capitalism, and so is President Clinton. Will all the attention spoil George Soros?
George Soros, in a way, is Donald Trump without the humility.
One of your money manager told us that George really does think he's a god.
I mean, if you think that you're God and you go into financial markets, you're bound to come out broke. So the fact that I'm not broke shows that I don't believe that I'm God.
Welcome to the Glenn Beck program. America Tonight, I ask you to watch this program with an open mind. I ask you to put your partisan differences aside and really listen, and then do your own homework. Don't take my word for it. Research yourself. This is far too important. The topic tonight and tomorrow night, George Soros, There are things that are happening in this country that don't make sense. Van Jones said something that bothered me over the summer. I mean, he said a lot of things over the years that have bothered me, but one comment in particular over the summer stuck with me, and it was this.
You handle the top down, but it's also bottom up and inside out. Top down, bottom up, and inside out. So now your challenge as you leave here, our challenge, is to take care of that bottom up part and that inside out part, the heart part.
That's bothered me, because I know who this guy is. He's a communist revolutionary, a guy who pined for the days of Stalin. The Iron Curtain went down. Something's wrong there. Well, it really bothered me until recently, when I started looking into all the George Soros connections and the size and the scope of his reach. And let me tell you something. I said to you, read up on George Soros. There's plenty of ways to read about him. These are all books about George Soros, many of them written by him. So there's no shortage of information, and read them. Read them. The comment doesn't bother me anymore. I understand what it means. And that's why that comment now frightens me. And I will put it into perspective tonight and tomorrow. Pull back the curtain and reveal what that actually means. And it will terrify you. There's a couple of other things that you'll understand. First of all, in 2003, Soros and a partner funded the new $5 million liberal group, MoveOn.org. Well, MoveOn.org, what exactly is that? Well, you remember it. This is the group that originally called General Petraeus General Betrayus. It was despicable. Well, who had they tapped for the executive director of MoveOn.org? This guy, Zach Exley. I've never heard of him before. Do you know who he is? Well, he previously had trained activists for the anarchist group, the Ruckus Society. These are the riots in Seattle, helped orchestrated by this guy. More on that in just a minute. Oh, by the way, he's also a blogger for the Huffington Post, which is interesting because the Huffington Post gets money from George Soros. Oh, and he's also a fellow with the George Soros Open Society Institute. Violent radicals. Oh, and by the way, it's just not that phrase that came. George Soros has been following him as he originally funded the Ella Baker Society, or the Center for Human Rights. And then, of course, he was on the Apollo Alliance. And then when he got fired from the White House, he went to Center for American Progress, which is also funded by George Soros. Radicals. Radicals. Oh, the Open Society Institute, in case you don't know what this is, don't worry, you will in the next couple of days. The Open Society Institute is George Soros' most important group. It is really spectacular. It is his philanthropist arm. This is where he looks for Mother Teresa to give out his precious money. And boy, did he find Mother Teresa. Well, not exactly. He found, to head this organization, the founder of the violent activist group SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. You don't know what they did in the 60s? You will. One string, $425 million every single year. The strings that are being pulled by the puppet master. Hello, America. There are a few working parts to a puppet show. There is the puppet master here. There's the stage. There's the audience. There are the strings to each puppet. And then there's the story. But there's also why. Why is the story? Why is the show happening? What is the puppet master? What is his motivation? Is it for the money? Is it for entertainment? Is it personal gain? What is it? Make no mistake, we are watching a show. The stage is the world. It's television, it's newspaper, it's speeches, it's the political elections, it's what's happening in Washington. You are the audience. And like any good show, they do have one goal in mind. They want you to feel something. But most shows don't have a hidden meaning behind it. They just want you to laugh. They want you to be entertained. This one, not so much. At the end of the show, you have a choice to make. They want you to get up from your seats. Of course, they have in mind what they are planning on you choosing, and they are just using this stage to try to make the case and convince you of it. It's really propaganda. Here's the propaganda book. Here it is. This is actually from one of Wilson's. Nasty, nasty guys. This is the book that I've told you before on propaganda that Hitler used. Goebbels. I just want to show you in propaganda, this is D. Now this is what's taught in schools. D. Democracy is administered by the intelligent minority who know how to regiment and guide the masses. That's great. This is Edward Bernays. Let me give you the whole quote here. He says, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, maybe almost a shadow government, remember that, which is the true ruling power of our country. Do we have a shadow government? Answer it now, remember how you answer it, and then answer it again after today's show and tomorrow's show. The question is, do we have a shadow government? And if we do, who are those intelligent minority that is guiding us through? And where are they guiding us to? If you skip past all of the puppets and the strings, if you stop looking at the puppets themselves, you have to see who's behind the puppets. Who is choosing the puppets and the players? Who's the puppet master? George Soros. Now, I am sure that this will be called a conspiracy theory, and quite honestly, a year ago, 2 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it myself. But it is right out in the open. I encourage you, do not take my word for this. Do your own research, and don't go to conspiracy websites or anything else. Go to his own books. Go to the biographies written about him. Go to things that are well documented, like 60 Minutes, things that are well known for their accuracy. We have all of the materials that put this show together at glennbeck.com and in my free email newsletter. I want you to see the footnotes on this program. Do not take anything I say as gospel tonight. I want you to decide for yourself. I want you to question with boldness. Is George Soros a man who says, yes, you will be perfect and you will be perfect? Is he really a puppet master? And if he is, how does he control? How does he control? Well, let's start with this. Let's just take a couple of examples here on what George Soros has said and then see if there's any connection to anything. Soros spoke at Columbia University. He talked about an urgent need for campaign finance reform. I want you to remember, questioning our elections is important to George Soros. You'll understand in about 20 minutes. Well, he wanted to have campaign finance reform. He thought it was important. He spoke at Columbia University about it. Well, Open Society, his little group, Open Society, started by the guy with SDS, it was one of only a handful of groups who spent $123 million to push finance reform. Soros, quote, said, do something about the distortion of our electoral process by the excessive use of TV advertising. So he wanted to make sure that lies couldn't distort things. Well, it wasn't long after that speech at Columbia University that, lo and behold, Senator Russ Feingold, a progressive, and a few months later, with John McCain, a Republican progressive, came with a proposal in hand for what would eventually become the McCain-Feingold Act. The irony, if it is that McCain-Feingold ultimately led to the explosion of 501c3 groups, which can advertise at will. 501c3 groups. Oh, 501c3 groups? You mean like Sojourners, or Color for Change, or the Tides Foundation, or Media Matters, or People for the American Way, or MoveOn.org, Center for American Progress, the Apollo Alliance, Elder Saker for Human Rights. You mean those things? You see, we had the McCain-Feingold Act, and then mysteriously, almost unbeknownst to everyone, those groups became very powerful, much more powerful. And guess who controls most of the most powerful? George Soros. George Soros, in the aftermath of 9/11, talked about police action as an alternative to war. Now, did anybody pick up on that? This is what he said. War is a false and misleading metaphor in the context of combating terrorism. Crimes require police work, not military action. George Soros. Here he is, the Democratic candidate for president, adopting crimes require police work, not military action positions.
What we've learned is that the war on terror is much more of an intelligence operation and a law enforcement operation.
The war on terror is far less of a military operation and far more of an intelligence-gathering law enforcement operation.
And that's what we have now in our office. Starts with George Soros. Days after President Obama was elected, George Soros again set the agenda. He said, quote, "I think we need a large stimulus package which will provide funds for state and local government to maintain their budgets because they are not allowed by the Constitution to run a deficit. For such a program to be successful, the federal government would need to provide hundreds of billions of dollars. In addition, another infrastructure program is necessary. In total, the cost would be between $300 and $600 billion range." Well, what was on the first thing on his agenda? The $787 billion stimulus bill. Gee, I remember this, and I remember saying at the time, who wrote this? It was too complex. It was too early in his, oh yeah, that's right, the Apollo Alliance. Where does the Apollo Alliance come from? The Tides Foundation. And where does the Tides Foundation get a lot of their funding? George Soros. Soros also heavily promotes green jobs and cap and trade. Also, days after Obama was elected, he called for a new energy bill. "I think this is a great opportunity to financially deal with global warming and energy independence. The U.S. needs a cap and trade system with the auctioning of license for emissions rights. I would use the revenues from these auctions to launch a new environmentally friendly energy policy that would be yet another federal program that could help us overcome the current stagnation." Well, Congress introduced, but you stood up. You said, "I don't think so." The audience started to revolt. Cap and trade failed. Now, through Freedom of Information Act, we find out that the Department of Energy and the EPA actually coordinated their response to damning reports on green jobs from Spain with the help of George Soros and his Center for American Progress, which gets their funding from here, George Soros. Here it is, December 9th, 2004. Also, there was this piece of information. This guy, where is Eli? Eli Pariser. There he is. He headed the Soros group, the front group, MoveOn.pac. Now, he wasn't upset that Kerry lost. Why? He explained this in an email. This is important that you understand. Quote, "In the last year, grassroots contributors like us gave more than $300 million to the Kerry campaign and the DNC and proved that the party doesn't need corporate cash to be competitive. It's now our party. We bought it, we own it, and we're going to take it back." Do you understand what just happened? George Soros got rid of all of the corporate money through McCain-Feingold, which then allowed all the 501c3s to come in. This one might help, and this one might help, and this one might help. And all the 501c...
Hi, I'm Bill O'Reilly. Thanks for watching us tonight. We have a powerful and important program, so I hope you stay through the whole thing. You won't be sorry. Buying political power. That is the subject of this evening's Talking Points memo. Factor has been investigating far-left billionaire George Soros, a man who wants to impose a radical left agenda on America. And under the radar, he is making great progress. Soros has set up a complicated political operation designed to do two things: buy influence among some liberal politicians and smear people with whom he disagrees. Now, here's a chart of how Soros and a few other wealthy radicals who help him are funneling money into the political process. Stay with me on this. Most of Soros's political money flows through his Open Society Institute. You see it there on the left, which is almost unlimited funding. Since 2001, according to federal documents, the Open Society Institute has given nearly $20 million to the Tides Foundation, right below that, an astounding amount. Now, Tides, in turn, funnels the money to a variety of radical hatchet men who are all well paid. For example, Tides has donated millions to the vile propaganda outfit Media Matters, which specializes in distorting comments made by politicians, pundits, and media people. Media Matters is an internet site, but directly feeds its propaganda to some mainstream media people, including elements at NBC News, columnists Frank Rich and Paul Krugman at the New York Times, columnist Jonathan Alter at Newsweek, and Bill Moyers at PBS. In fact, as president of the Schumann Center Foundation, Moyers oversaw at least a $500,000 transfer of money to Media Matters. We'll have more on that tomorrow. Now, George Soros is also pouring money into the Center for American Progress, run by former Clinton aide John Podesta, and the Democracy Alliance Group, both of which fund Media Matters as well. So you can see an enormous amount of money this Media Matters has control of. Finally, George Soros has given the radical left organization Move On many, many millions of dollars. This group actively supports liberal politicians like Howard Dean and John Edwards. It also organizes demonstrations promoting left-wing causes. So you can see how powerful this guy Soros has become. He can smear anyone he wants in a variety of ways. His organizations can raise millions for politicians who will do his bidding. Thus, he can demand that politicians running for office do what he tells them to do. If a liberal politician doesn't toe the Soros line, he or she will be denied funding and brutally attacked. Just ask Senator Joseph Lieberman about what Move On and Media Matters did to him. Now, Talking Points has reason to believe John Edwards is taking orders from the Soros group right now, and other Democratic politicians may be as well. The goal of George Soros, Peter Lewis, Susie Tompkins Buell, and other radical financiers is to buy a presidential election. By that I mean find and fund a candidate who will tacitly do what he or she is told to do. In the past, big business has been accused of doing just that. Now it is the likes of George Soros, an extremist who wants open borders, a one-world foreign policy, legalized drugs, euthanasia, and on and on. My book, Culture Warrior, documents the Soros policy and his tax-evading businesses located in Curacao and Bermuda. The really frightening thing about all this is that most Americans have never even heard of George Soros. This is off-the-chart dangerous, but completely legal under the McCain-Feingold Act. In the weeks to come, we'll have more on Soros and his operations, including naming more of the mainstream media that is actively helping him, which includes Rosie O'Donnell. And that is the memo. Now for the top story tonight, reaction to our investigation. Joining us now from Atlanta, Phil Kent, author of the book Foundations of Betrayal, How the Liberal Super-Rich Undermine America. And here in the studio, conservative radio talk show host Monica Crowley. Monica, begin with you. Did I leave anything out?
No, I think you were right on. And you know what? This is an incredibly well-oiled, brilliantly orchestrated machine. And as you pointed out, it's also a brilliant way to get around the campaign finance laws in this country. You have one guy in George Soros. You had mentioned big business had been criticized for this stuff before. Here you've got all of this power in the hands of one guy because he's got $1 billion fortune where he can put his money wherever he wants. The problem is twofold. Number one, transparency. This guy's been able to fly under the radar for a long time before you just exposed him because the mainstream media protects him because they're on the same ideological
Okay, and
page.
also because it's a complicated, you see where the money flow goes. Can you put that chart up again? Because it goes through 3 or 4 places before it gets to the intended source.
Exactly, but you know, this is a web, but it's not a particularly tangled web because, as you pointed out in this chart, you can trace it back 2 or 3 organizations away from George Soros. He's not even making an attempt to keep his fingerprints off of this. And the other point too, Bill, is accountability. So you have transparency, okay, which he's trying to obfuscate with this kind of web, but also accountability. So he can finance websites like you mentioned, Media Matters, other organizations that will go out there and smear right-wing politicians, smear right-wing pundits and commentators and so on, and there's no accountability because it's floating out there on the web.
But we live in a thing of freedom of speech. Now, Mr. Kent, you know, you got to admire Soros for coming up with this organization. I mean, you know, he's made billions by doing this in business, by being in Curacao and Bermuda and France, where he was convicted of a felony. And he knows how to do this. He knows how to move the money around and use it to gain influence. And now he set his sights on changing the basic fabric of this country.
Well, that's right. George Soros is really the Dr. Evil of the whole world of left-wing foundations. In fact, one of his most chilling quotes a few years ago was that the main obstacle to a stable and just world is the United States. He really hates this country, and he funds these things, as your chart points out, and open borders, and even radical Islamic groups that defend suicide bombers. So this guy is all over the map.
I didn't have that on there. Now, what's the radical Islamic group that defends suicide bombers?
The American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee Research Institute is a Soros recipient, and they've actually defended suicide bombers. And I've got this in my book, and how he funds La Raza, the race, the open borders advocacy
he funds
group,
La Raza, we know that. Now, what is the intrusion of the mainstream media? Because you have some pretty big names. Bill Moyers, Wednesday night, he's going to take a big shot at the press on PBS. We know he's in bed with Soros. Rosie O'Donnell, not taken seriously, but certainly a platform every day on ABC. New York Times, two of their main columnists, Newsweek magazine, Jonathan Alter, and NBC News, where it's pitiful, but they have commentators that basically take exactly what Soros gives them and spit it out over the airwaves. That's a lot of power, is it not?
It's a lot of power. Soros really does believe wealth controls culture, and he wants to really control the political scene in the United States and the media. And as your chart points out, it's very chilling, the groups that he is funding through the Open Society Institute. You know, the assets alone of this private tax-exempt foundation, over $175 million.
Wow.
And as you point out, he loves the Tides Foundation, a big left-wing tax-exempt foundation.
I didn't know it was that high right now, 175 million tax-free. Now, Monica, if you're like Lieberman and you're a moderate Democrat, Soros could put a big hurt on you fast.
That's right. I mean, I mentioned right-wing commentators, right-wing politicians, but if you are a moderate, responsible Democrat who happens to take a different point of view than George Soros, you are just as much of a target.
Now, we believe that John Edwards has forged some kind of a arrangement with Soros. I can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, but his actions are pretty much dictated by Move On. He's absolutely right in with those people. Have you seen that?
I have heard that reported, Bill, and you know that's the real danger here, is that there are campaign finance laws on the books to prevent exactly this, to prevent a politician from being held in the pocket by a fabulously rich guy like George Soros.
Yeah, I mean, this is off the chart.
That's right,
Really
and then if you don't toe the line, you run the risk of being cut off by somebody like this.
Well, and attacked,
and you do not want to court that danger, not if you're running for president.
And they don't stop at you. They'll go for your family. They'll go for anyone. Ms. Kennedy, I'm going to give you the last word, but are there any Republican or conservative groups that rival Soros?
You know, I tell you, the research that I compiled in my book, if you take the top 3 conservative tax-exempt foundations, they're totally dwarfed by Soros and the Radical Ford Foundation. It's probably 15 times more of the assets. Remember, MoveOn.org and Soros spent $5 million alone in anti-Bush ads in 2004. They have got clout.
Yeah, it'll be 4 times, 5 times that much in the 2008 election. Monica, Mr. Kent, thanks very much. We appreciate it. Next on the rundown, once again, the mayor of San Francisco says he will not obey the law. And later, the Factor did not use the Alec Baldwin tape. We will explain why we decided not to use it. Upcoming.
We will make America great again.
But nearly half of your financial sector donations appear to come from just two wealthy financiers, George Soros and Donald Sussman, for a total of about $10 million.
Move on, and Soros have given almost 90% of their funding to Hillary. Now, they're giving about 10% to Sanders to have some control in case he beats her. But they're all in, basically, 90% for her. So that's confirmation. So this is a big deal, folks.
I think everybody in the country has now heard about these violent protests in Chicago, which are being blamed on supporters of Bernie Sanders. Alex, this is a false flag. These demonstrators are flying under a false banner. They are not Sanders supporters by and large. This is an operation directed by supporters of Hillary Clinton, paid for by George Soros and Move On, by David Brock at Media Matters from America, also funded by Soros, and also by the reclusive billionaire Jonathan Lewis.
We have a right to speak. I mean, we are law-abiding people. We're people that work very hard. We're people that have built this country and made this country great. And we're all together, and we want to get along with everybody. But when they have organized, professionally staged wise guys, we've got to fight back. We've got to fight back.
How long have you been friends with George Soros? I don't know. I've known him for, I suppose, since he was trying to help the Balkans after the Bosnian War. Can you be a favor and put that back? I can be like this. Hey, that's
The globalists have controlled the mainstream media for a long time, but now they're expanding and making the weaponization even more vicious and deceptive. All the major networks are state-run.
We are partnering this year with the NFL.
The NFL has become a political weapon against the Second Amendment and pushes Obamacare. MSNBC tells us that our children belong to the state.
We have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities.
It is more important than ever to realize that we are not the alternative media. We are the true media. The establishment dinosaur press is dying.
We are in an information war, and we are losing that war.
Join us at InfoWarsNews.com and PrisonPlanet.tv. Members can share their memberships with up to 11 people. By subscribing, you will literally be buying war bonds in the info war to expand our operation in the face of the tyrants. Join us at PrisonPlanet.tv.
George Soros is the world's most famous investor and speculator. It was his fund that earned in excess of $1 billion when he bet against the British pound in 1992. But he is more than just a money manager with one of the best track records in history. He is also a noted philanthropist whose gifts include a fund to prevent Russian nuclear scientists from selling their knowledge to a donation to help the children of war-torn Bosnia. Through his Open Society Fund, he has set up foundations throughout Eastern Europe with the hope of assisting those countries towards more free and democratic societies. It is a pleasure to have him back at this table for more conversation because there's a new book called Soros on Soros, Staying Ahead of the Curve, which is a reflection of his philosophy about business, his philosophy about philanthropy, and his philosophy about an open society on the basis of some interviews done with him by Byron Wayne of Morgan Stanley. Welcome back. Let me first talk about the Eastern Europe. Sure. Give me your report card on what you think both your own foundations have been able to accomplish and how the political and economic situation is there in terms of Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia.
Well, it's very mixed. I think that a great opportunity to move that whole region towards what I call open societies has been missed. And there's now, in many places, a tendency to develop some new form of totalitarian regimes. Well, totalitarian is too strong a word, but authoritarian regimes based on nationalist ideology in combination with newly emerging business interests. And that is the sort of classic recipe for fascism. Now, you know, I don't want to overstate the case, because there are many countries like exactly Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, that are sort of really moving towards Europe. And the case in Russia, of course, is up for grabs. It's very much a struggle which way it's going to go. But there are other countries, like, for instance...
Between democratic forces and how would you characterize the alternative?
Well, it's sort of a new authoritarian regime based on nationalism.
Right.
This is the...
Zhirinovsky and others who think
right,
like he does.
Zhirinovsky is fading,
right.
But maybe Levitt is rising.
Right.
But whoever wants to win the elections will have to take a somewhat xenophobic, anti-Western point of view, because people have been very disappointed by the changes which have occurred.
Well, in fact, Bill Safar, in a column today in the New York Times, pointed out that Boris Yeltsin, in order to win re-election, may become very strongly anti-Western in both the convention, both NATO as well as the conventional arms agreement.
When Yeltsin went to Poland the first time, he quite agreed to Poland joining NATO, and then his advisor said, no, you can't let that go. And of course, the objections on Bosnia are very largely, playing to the domestic audience.
To the ethnic community who's a domestic force in Russian politics.
Although, frankly, people in Russia don't give a damn about Bosnia. I mean, this is just grandstanding. It's not a real issue in Russia. They care about Chechnya. People deeply care about what happened in Chechnya. Bosnia is not an issue that is discussed outside Parliament.
And they care about Chechnya to the detriment of Boris Yeltsin and blame him for what happened.
People are very upset about that horrible incident. Yes.
But does he win re-election, you think?
Well, it's too early to say. First, you've got the parliamentary elections, and there is a hope of sort of a democratic center with this Chernomyrdin party, and Yavlinsky is doing well in the polls. But I'm afraid that the anti-reform elements may predominate.
Yavlinsky is someone you admire very much for his economic ideas.
Well, altogether, I have great respect for him, because he's one man who actually stands by his ideas. He's really remained, let's say, clean in a society where very few people have been able to.
If someone came to you and said, have your foundation investments, the amount of money that you have through foundation, creating the university, Central European University?
Yes.
Creating the university and other things you have done to promote the notion of an open society. Have those seeds been worth the effort?
Yes.
Would you say yes, or would you say...
No question about it. I mean, I think that when you look at the entirety of what the foundations have done, it's been very worthwhile and very effective. Yet if you look at individual programs, many have failed. We have had many difficulties. In Russia, we have had about 3 putsches where the foundation had to be cleaned up. So it's been one long struggle with lots of difficulties, but when you look at the results, very rewarding.
Philanthropy for you is more rewarding than anything you do?
Well, I've got great reservations about philanthropy. Actually, I really think that charity is a very corrupting activity, and it is so. Even in my own foundations, and I'm struggling against it all the time.
Where does the corruption come from?
Well, first of all, you corrupt the people that you give money to, because you don't teach them self-reliance, but you teach them to depend on you.
You teach them dependence rather than interdependence.
That's right. So you make them, they become objects of charity, which, I mean, we avoid. But then it's very corrupting to the giver, because people suck up to him. People will tell him what people, when they go to a foundation, they tell the foundation what the foundation wants to hear. And then when they get the money, they do with it what they want to do. And the two are not the same.
Does it cause you to want to pull back from philanthropy because you believe that it might not be?
No, but I must say that I got sucked into something that I knew was full of paradoxes and contradictions.
Did you do it in the beginning because you had made so much money that you wanted to carry forward a philosophy you believed in?
Well, it had to do with that, in the sense that when I made more money than what I needed for my own good, I thought, how can I serve the public good? But until quite recently, the foundations have not been driven by money. In other words, it wasn't that we had to give away a certain amount of money. And fortunately, it hadn't also been that we didn't have money to give in case there was a good cause. So it was really the merit of the particular project that mattered.
Let me talk about the business end and come back to the philosophical end for a second. There has been much talk about your comeback. During the bad times of certainly the beginning of '95, I guess, when did the comeback begin, when you began to once again connect?
Well, no, I don't. No, I think this shouldn't be taken out of context. We have had, several patches. We have an average performance of something like 35%
over the last
20 odd years, 26 years. But it's made up of years which are 5% or 8%, and years that are 60% or 100%. That's how you get the average.
Yeah.
And we had 4 wonderful years, 90 to 93 inclusive, and 94 we were only up 4%, which was our second worst year. And in the first half of this year, we were actually down when the market was up.
That's what I referred to.
And that was a sort of a bad patch.
But you have said, you're quoted as saying that somehow you began to feel somewhat that the forces were against you, in a sense. I mean, did you?
Well, we just didn't get it right. We had the opportunities were there, and we got caught. And it didn't hang together, but we got it together now.
All right, but stay with me though. Let me explore this, because there is something I think for people to say. What happened when you were on such a roll that you began to hit the rough patch?
Right.
What did it do to you, and what did it cause you to question, and how did you come out of it?
Well, first of all, I'm immune because I've now got a young team.
I know.
They do all the work, and I'm very supportive, and I worry for them, but I don't really worry.
Well, Stanley Druckenmiller and people like that have gotten all the credit.
But they took all the pain, because managing money the way we do is extremely painful. A very responsible job and very stressful. And I don't actually feel the stress. If I did, I probably wouldn't be able to sit here and talk to you. So that's number one.
You don't feel the stress anymore because it's not your judgments that are on the line?
I'm not on the line.
Right.
They are on the line, and I'm just stand behind them. I'm coach,
right,
and they are performing. It's
right.
Of
You're
course
the coach and Stanley's the quarterback, is that?
Right. So of course I'm involved, you constantly re-examine what you're doing wrong, and you slowly you tentatively get things right. But you can't really get a dynamic going until you have a little profit under your belt, because it's very different when you're risking your principal than when you're risking your profit. So that's how you get these runs, when you get it right, and then you can risk more and make more money. When you have lost it, when you're doing poorly, you've got to retrench. And even as you get it right, you don't get the performance until you can do it on a larger scale, because risking your profit, you see, is much easier.
It's less terrifying than risking your principal.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we have such a good record is because we never lose our principal. Once we are in a bad position, we retrench. So we might lose a little bit, but we're never in danger.
Because you leverage well.
That's right. We deleverage when we are not making money.
You stop leveraging. I assume that's what deleveraging means.
Yeah.
But in the sterling coup, which would not coup, in the investment there, where you captured the attention of the world and certainly the Bank of England.
Right.
Did you put $10 billion at risk or not?
Yes.
Now, was that all profit or was that principal?
Well, it was our principal, but it was not all at risk, because the most we could have lost would have been, let's say, 2-3%, because there was no. It was a high reward, low risk bet.
Right.
In other words, if it had gone wrong, we would have had the transaction cost of undoing it. Right. Whereas if we got it right, we made something like 15-20%. So we did put all our equity at risk, but it wasn't, it wasn't really very much of an excellent.
You weren't risking $10 billion, you were risking $1 billion or
less, even less.
Even less.
No, substantially less.
Yeah.
We made $1 billion, but we made more than $1 billion actually. But we could have lost a few $100 million, which would have been perfectly acceptable.
1995. I want to move past business, but stay with me for a second. In 1995, the beginning of '95, when you began to, it was a rough patch. Did you change your ideas about macro investing and looking at everything at that time? Did you call into question any part of your philosophy about investing or your practices over the previous 25 years?
Not the philosophy, not the approach, but every one of our position was very much re-examined. Yeah. And actually one of the things we did was to focus more on individual stocks, and not just the macro, because the macro is one bet. You see, whereas if you select particular stocks, you have a thesis concerning an industry or a company, then you have, let's say, a division of risk, so you can do a little more.
Yeah. When your philosophy about equity investments when looking at a company has to do with management, has to do with.
Right now it does, because this is an era of high capitalism, if you like, where the interests of the shareholders rule supreme, and managements pay a lot of attention to the interests of the shareholders. And if you can
and that's a change you find, that there's much more of a sensitivity to shareholders and return to shareholders than been in the past.
That is correct. And therefore, if you can identify managements which are changing their attitude, or where there's a change of management, you can be very well rewarded.
Yeah. You say this is a golden age of capitalism. It continues.
Yes.
What is it about where we are economically in the world, looking at it globally, that makes you optimistic about capitalism?
Well, don't
put words in your mouth.
No, please don't, because I'm not so optimistic. In fact, I'm pretty sure that this golden age is not going to last forever, because it's built on false foundations. We've had a similar period, let's say, at the end of the last century, and it didn't last. You had global markets. Money didn't move as fast as it's moving now, but it moved just as much. It was very similar to what we have today. In fact, it was more stable than what we have today, because first of all, you had the gold standard as opposed to the fluctuating currency system, which is much more unstable that we have now. And secondly, you had an imperial power, England, that was the main beneficiary of this global trading system, the City of London. And they were perfectly willing to send a gunboat or two to faraway places in order to, put down the native, keep the natives in place.
To maintain the empire.
That's right. We don't have that now, because the United States is the sole remaining superpower, but is not the main beneficiary of this global trading system. And therefore, we can't be the policeman of the world. We can't afford it. We don't want to be. And therefore, there is no policeman. And there is no imperial power. There is no balance of powers as you had during the Cold War, when you had these two superpowers sort of keeping each other in check. So you have a vacuum, a power vacuum. You have instability. And this is actually one of the main points I make in the book. This cannot last like this. We actually need an international security system. And the trouble is that the United Nations has failed just at a time when it would be most needed.
Bosnia being one perfect example.
Bosnia has been to the United Nations as Abyssinia was to the League of Nations in 1935. It showed that the League of Nations doesn't work.
Proved its impotency.
That's right. And this is an issue for us, particularly for the United States, because we created the United Nations. It's our design. We are the leading power, but we say the United Nations failed. They failed. Yeah. It's us that have decided not to.
For a number of reasons, including the fact that the rest of the world, and certainly the Western world, Japan and Europe, Bosnia being one small example, is looking to us for leadership.
Yes.
Is that just a failure of this administration or a failure of a mindset in America about our role in the world?
I think it's a bipartisan issue.
Right.
I think that the Republicans have to make up their minds whether they want to support the United Nations or not. I think that, and if they don't, what role are we going to play in the world?
Stay with me on that. In terms of Bosnia and what the Clinton administration has done, are you supportive because of your concern for what's happened to the children of Sarajevo?
Look, I think that we did finally. You see, when actually the survival of NATO became an issue, because NATO got involved and it lost its credibility, and for us, maintaining the credibility of NATO is what really moved us. And also to help Clinton in his re-election campaign,
because I think strong in foreign policy.
Yeah, because there was a great weakness there, so he had to do something. Well, it just once we took action, it seems to have an effect. I mean, it has moved the situation dramatically. Now, unfortunately, it happened too late, and while it is beneficial in the sense of bringing the end much closer, the damage that has been done, it cannot be undone, and we must really recognize this as a terrible failure and learn from it, because basically what we have done has been to allow the ethnic principle, the principle of ethnic cleansing, to prevail. And
whether it's practiced by the Serbs or the Croatians, or
well, actually, the real victor in this situation is Croatia, yes, which has become a nation state with less than 2% Serb population, and there's been 180,000 Serbs that have been expelled from Croatia. Now,
with little opprobrium from the world.
Yes, and I think that that is an issue. I think that it cannot be undone now. I think it's a fact. But what kind of Croatia you're going to have is very important, and this is what we have to pay attention to.
But let me come back to the United States and what we might do. The United States, you think, began to say we have to do something different in order to rescue NATO, right, which was clearly ineffectual and being called into question. And we're now talking about NATO expansion.
Yes.
What can be done now, in a sense, not with respect to Bosnia, but about the future of NATO? What has to happen, and has the United States, by these actions, in a sense, recreated
well, it has saved
a military arrangement that has no mission like it had in the Cold War?
You're putting your finger on it, because I think it has saved NATO, but the mission of NATO, what is it supposed to do, remains unclear. Is it directed at Russia? Then it means we want to turn Russia into an enemy. Right. So I think that the mission of NATO has to be redefined.
And what might it be?
I think that that they ought to stand to protect open societies, basically, and we ought to generally, in this part of the world particularly, care about what kind of regime prevails in a country. In other words, our attitude to Russia should be different depending what kind of regime it is. Is it a democratic regime, or is it an authoritarian regime? It's not, Russia in this geopolitical chess board, that...
Well, but let me take that along. So let's assume it shifts to a totalitarian regime.
Right.
And moves away from any kind of democratic regime. Right. How should our posture towards that regime be different?
Well, I think that our posture should be different before it shifts there. In other words,
in order to promote one area or the other, one direction or the other.
That's right. I mean, we had an incredible opportunity to help that part of the world to move towards democracy. That opportunity is now greatly restricted because it's now, we are 5-6 years into the revolution. So again, you can't go back in time. But still, we could learn from the mistakes we made in the last 5 years and still work towards strengthening democracy in that part of the world.
Was it difficult for you, because of your own experience in that area, to, over that period of years from the fall of communism and the fall of the wall and the decline of those regimes, to sit back and see opportunity and not watch, because I don't think the administrations, whether it was Bush or Clinton, seemed to know exactly what to do, and secondly, to know that they had the will of the people to do it in terms of investment?
Well, you see, I didn't sit. I actually threw everything I had into it, and I'm very satisfied having done it. I would have liked to influence policy, and I tried. I tried to get to Bush before he met Gorbachev in Malta, which I thought was the last time really to change the direction from the outside. I was unable to do that. So I think that I've succeeded in everything, not everything, but in most of the things that I could do on my own. And I failed in influencing the policy.
But today, Strobe Talbot is the principal, the Deputy Secretary of State, is the principal architect of our policy towards Russia. Yes?
Yes, yes.
You have, he listens to you.
He does. He does.
So you have influence on the part of the principal policymaker, not only towards Russia, but towards Eastern Europe.
Yes.
Right?
No, I do now have access. No question. We actually work together. The country where I'm most engaged and we are really working together is Ukraine.
Yes.
Because there was a chance to change the direction. The country was sinking, it was disintegrating, it was failing. And a new president was elected, and for the first time, the West, under American leadership, had the wisdom to say, we will invest $4 billion if there is a reform program. So that, and now Ukraine has changed. Now, it's early days, it's very tough. I'm very engaged on working on it, and we have good working relations with the American government, with the international institutions. And I'm hopeful, finally, in this one case, we are doing the right thing as much as one can from the outside.
When asked, is your opinion also that we ought to push forward with NATO expansion regardless of what the Russian government says?
I think I think that the issue is, the question is raised the wrong way. Let Europe admit Poland and Hungary to the European Union. Security will take care of itself. Let us have a constructive policy towards Russia, and Russia will not object.
So your idea is forget NATO, let them come into some other kind of economic arrangement or security arrangement rather than NATO, because it is NATO that inflames the Russians or causes at least their paranoia.
There's a saying that war is an extension of politics.
Right.
I say let's concentrate on politics and not war. I mean, it's a failure of politics when we come to war. So let's deal with the political and economic situation in those countries.
That puts you at odds, I think, with Henry Kissinger, who is one of the people who endorse your book.
We could have a very good debate, because we do have a difference of opinion.
All right. Let me come back to the world economic situation. You believe that you're bearish on the economic future of France and Germany. Bearish.
No, I'm concerned. I'm concerned about the trend towards European disintegration.
Yeah.
That is to say, you have a disequilibrium situation after the reunification of Germany. And first there was an attempt to accelerate the integration. It peaked in the Maastricht Treaty. It failed in the process of ratifying that treaty, and now we are in a period of disintegration, and that I think is very harmful, because it puts us right back where we were in the interwar period. Nation states with different interests clashing.
You mean between World War I and World War II?
Yes.
Right.
And so this is now disturbing disintegration of the European Union.
But you have said you're bearish on the economies of France and Germany. I read that over the weekend in the Washington Post.
No, I'm bearish on the French stock market because Germany has a sort of set very stringent conditions
on budget reductions.
Insisted that France has to meet the criteria of the Maastricht Treaty in order to have a common currency. France is lagging, and there's now a confrontation shaping up between the independent central bank in France and the government. And I think that there's going to be a government crisis, and I don't think that Juppé might not survive.
What do you think of Chirac so far?
I admired his stand on Bosnia.
Yes.
I think he showed some leadership. It's a new.
And how about nuclear testing?
That I think was. I think a mistake. Yeah. I think it should have been avoided.
I'm told he had some influence on Clinton's thinking about Bosnia.
I think that it was one of the elements that moved this administration to action.
Okay, I'm coming to the U.S. economy in a second. Let's go to Japan.
Yeah.
You believe that they have dealt with their interest rate problems there, but have not dealt with a significant structural issue they have there, which is that the finance minister has enormous control.
Right. No, you see, Japan faces a problem of deflation, the likes of which we have not seen since the Depression. Prices are falling and economic activity is falling. It was a very disturbing development. The banking system is in deep trouble, a lot of bad loans. The government has taken steps to try to dig itself out of this hole. One of the ways of doing it is actually to try to get the yen down in value. This gives a little opportunity to people like me to make some money and dig ourselves out of the hole.
Yeah, I know. You've lost some money on the yen, did you not?
That's right. So interest
some money
rates,
is putting it lightly, probably.
Interest rates have been reduced practically to 0.5%.
Right.
And finally, the yen is falling in value, and there's the problem of Keynes mentioned this problem of pushing on a string. But there are these holes in the banking system, so you can push a lot of string into those holes. So you will be able to do something. So I think that Japan will probably dig itself out. But it hasn't even started to deal with the structural issue, which has gotten it into the hole. Because what people don't realize, we sort of so admire this fabulous industrial
economic
machine.
miracle that's taken place there.
The industrial machine, where Japan really has comparative advantage in practically every industry that it enters.
Because they were modernized after the war and they had appropriate management.
Yeah, I think it's a lot. It has a lot to do with mentality.
Right, that's what I want to say.
Really sort of a work ethic, and in a way, sort of a feudal mentality, which is good for producing, but not very good for trading, not very good for playing financial markets. For that, you need a different mentality, a commercial mentality, and that they don't have. And because of that, they have this financial machine, which is under the control of the Minister of Finance. It's run by bureaucrats and operated by bureaucrats, and they have actually frittered away practically all the wealth.
Oh, the profits of the industrial miracle.
That's right. So there's this tremendous failure next to the tremendous success. We've been mesmerized by the success. We haven't paid attention to the failure.
How about China? What's your feeling about China and all the talk about the potential of China, both as a market because of 1 billion plus people,
Well, I have a little theory about China, and that is that the communist regime will be swept out of power by an old-fashioned capitalist bust.
What do you mean?
Well, because basically the regime has lost the mandate of heaven, so as they call it, namely the trust of the people, and is now tolerated because it delivers economic advance.
Right.
And it does it
because
by
it's opened itself up to capitalist.
Yeah, it attracts foreign investment,
Right.
which is the engine driving the. And if ever that engine goes into reverse, then you're going to have political trouble, which will push the foreign investors further into reverse, which will then create further political problems. So you could have a political and economic collapse together.
Well, might it happen when Deng Xiaoping dies, after all, when he died, because of the competition among...
I think
he's essentially dead. Yeah.
I think he's dead. So I think that...
I don't want to say that essentially dead. I mean,
no,
clearly...
no, I mean, it's to all intents and purposes. So I don't know how. I'm not sufficiently close to it to be able to have a more concrete sense of it.
But that's an interesting idea, that because that if the economic force brought by capitalism should falter,
that's right,
then it's the only thing that's propping up this regime, because they have no political viability. They would say, I suspect, yeah, we do. We have an army, and that's how we maintain our power, and that's how we stay in power.
That is true. That is true.
You know, so we don't need any other kind of power.
Yes, but I think that
power, as Mao Zedong said, you know, power comes at the end of a gun barrel.
That may be true, but that is irreconcilable with economic progress, because the army is a drain on the economy, and actually it is in China, I think, quite a severe drain.
Also, I mean, the notion is, I mean, someone said to me the other day, you know, the reason that they want to sell, although they've canceled the contract of selling to the Iranians, was because so many of the people there's so much corruption at the upper levels who are taking advantage of those economic profits.
Well,
you know, and that corruption might become exposed.
The second generation of
the sons are
the new entrepreneurs.
Yeah,
of course, it's the same in Russia.
The United States. You think we have successfully managed a soft landing?
That's right.
You know, and the future,
I think that our economy is in very good shape.
Inflation is under control?
Inflation is under control. The economy is not going into any kind of a recession. It's not overheating. There's a lot of increase in productivity. I think that this whole technological revolution, the information revolution, incidentally, it means that our cost of living index is out of whack. We have been overstating the cost of living, and if we reduce it, that would relieve the budget of the COLA, you know, and that
cost
I think,
of living adjustment.
Yes, right. And that I think has great, very bullish implications for the market.
Now, until I read you had said that, I had no idea about this notion that inflation is 1% less.
Yes.
You know, is this widely discussed or thought about, or is this simply an argument that you have?
No. It is. It has been a commission, and it's very much in the works. It's a question whether it is really as much as 1% or not.
But you have said it'll save us $160 billion.
That's right.
You know.
That's right. Yes. Somehow it's not in the market yet.
Yeah. Why isn't this a ringing endorsement of President Clinton?
Actually, it is. I mean, if that's the issue, he's done well for the economy. It ought to work for him in the elections. I think he has a reasonable chance of getting re-elected, actually.
Yeah, I do too.
Even though I am extremely critical on his failure on the foreign policy
But do you
side.
believe he's coming around, though? I mean, he's had recent foreign policy successes. I mean, people will look at Haiti, they'll look at Ireland, which is not entirely his, but he played a role in that. You've got the Middle East, where there's an additional now, phase 2, on the West Bank. I mean, there are a number of things that people are saying, while you don't win elections on foreign policy, what you do is erase notions that you don't know what you're doing.
That's probably right. That's probably right. I find it rather hard to take that that's the only motivation that seems to be driving the administration, because I think that we have greater responsibilities in the world.
Are you supporting him or not?
I supported him last time, but I can't at this point. I can't because of our foreign policy failure. But I may revise my view. I haven't decided how.
Do you have? You don't have a candidate then?
No, I don't have a candidate, and I don't intend to mix in domestic politics. I think that I do have a foreign policy agenda, but it's really a bipartisan agenda, and I don't think I can advance it by sort of taking sides.
Let me talk about you and your biography, which we have talked about before on this program. Born in Hungary, when you were 14 years old, your father taught you, you say, in a masterful way, the art of survival.
Yeah.
What did you mean?
Well, because, this was the German occupation. We would have been taken away and killed. And he had enough sense, because of his previous experiences, to realize that the normal...
What do you mean his previous experiences?
Well, he was a prisoner of war in Russia,
right.
And he escaped, and he lived through the Russian Revolution, and he came back from that a changed man, because he saw this turmoil, fighting, and I mean he went through a horrendous experience, and that taught him a lesson which then came in very useful. He in turn taught me a lesson which came in useful to me.
Which is the art of survival, which is...
Well, it's basically that there are times when the normal rules don't apply. You see, the way you've looked at the world is just not applicable because the world has changed. It's a revolutionary situation.
When has it been applicable in your life, and when has it been employed in your life?
Well, it was certainly had this experience with the Nazi regime, then the communist regime, the beginnings of the communist regime, and then actually I've kind of specialized on these far from equilibrium situations in the financial markets. That's been my specialty.
But explain more.
In other words, changes, you see, people generally play with a certain set of rules. Right. And I am particularly interested in changes in the rules of the game. And so I'm looking for the new game and the new rules, how they are played. So because I'm attuned to that, I can sort of sometimes anticipate or understand these periods of regime change when something really new is happening. Let's say anything to do with technology, let's say internet is something really revolutionary. It's something probably comparable to the invention of printing, and is happening currently. Now that changes a lot of things in technology stocks. And
was that the reason for the investors' enthusiasm for Netscape?
That's right. That's right. No, that may be, of course, an exuberance, but still, that is far from equilibrium. That's a revolutionary change.
That is just the internet, in your judgment, the World Wide Web, is as important as the printing press.
Yes, I think it will change, the way we do many things. Not just, I mean, the way we do research, the way we do our shopping, the way we communicate with people. It's to a large extent, I think it will replace television because it will replace the newspapers, because we'll probably get the information sort of collated for us.
Yes.
So I mean, it's too difficult to anticipate.
But do you have a clear vision?
No, I don't have a clear vision. I just have a vision that there's some.
You know that there's a moment of change.
I have a chaotic vision, not a clear vision.
You have a moment, but you know there's a moment of change here taking place because of the internet.
Yes.
Because it changes the way the world speaks to each other.
That's right.
The individuals in the world, and gives people the capacity to go around institutions,
right,
that they have access to institutions in a different way. It sort of democratizes,
that's right,
in a way.
Yeah, it will change many things. So that's one example. But I mean, you take, let's say, Europe, the integration and disintegration of Europe. Those are, you know, what we talked about. It makes me bearish on the French market. So those are the changes that I look at.
Now, does that still mean you adhere to macro investing, or is it?
Oh yes, of course.
And that basically is looking at looking at a series of forces that you think.
Yes.
Whatever the currency you're looking at, whether it's bonds or stocks, right, or commodities or currency.
Right. Well, if it's a macroeconomic change, then you've got sort of macro instruments like bonds,
right,
or which allow you to play them.
Yeah. How have you changed after all of this money and all of this attention? I mean, what has it caused you to do with the way you live your life and choices you make for yourself?
Well, I think it empowered me in many ways. I mean, it has given me freedom, and it has also given me an ability to have much greater impact than otherwise. And of course, with that goes the responsibility of what kind of impact do you want to make, right? So it really makes you think. So I've become, let's say, a more effective person, but now I've become also a more reflective person, because my own life has changed, and I need to think things through again. And actually, the book is an attempt to do so.
But this is thinking out loud in terms of questions about who you are and the philosophy. You have suggested one role model for you was John Maynard Keynes, and both because he was an investor and a theoretician, because he had a Keynesian philosophy about the way the markets work.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of, I was asked, well,
I know,
do you
but
have any models? So, I mean, you know.
I'm not suggesting you're comparing yourself to Keynes, but you look at someone who had a life and you say he was a philosopher.
I think that's a full life, you see, to actually to participate and to think, to interact. I mean, for me, thinking and understanding is the most important thing. But for many years in my youth, you know, I was deeply involved in profound philosophical questions, and I went on over and over the same questions until I was really spinning my wheels. I wasn't getting anywhere. Then I entered the real world, and I moved forward, you see. My wheels grabbed on. And that has enabled me to bring my own thinking forward. So let's say the conceptual framework, which I outlined there, I formed it in my student days, but I've developed it a lot further. You see, so I think that I'm, you know.
What did markets teach you about your philosophical framework?
Well, it was a laboratory where I could test my ideas. And
because it is a hard-headed, very realistic laboratory.
Yeah, it's a hard taskmaster.
Yes,
you see.
you know.
So there is such a thing as reality. Okay, there's one should realize, and funny thing to say that the market is reality, because it seems to be so far removed from reality. But that is actually a very good example of what reality is, because all the false ideas and misconceptions that we have, and which play in the market, is part of the reality that we have to think about. So the role of misconceptions is tremendously important in forming reality. You see, that
the reality of the market is infused by your recognition of all the misassumptions that go into it.
You see, one of the major misconceptions, which we sort of started with the Greek philosophers and then was reinforced by science, the success of science, is that our thinking is here and reality is there. And there's a correspondence between the two. You know, we try to understand what's out there. But in effect, our thinking is part of the reality that we are trying to understand. You see, so instead of thinking of sort of two parallel things. We have to realize that there is one big thing, which is reality, okay? And there really is such a thing, and we are part of it. And being part of it, we can't possibly encompass it, understand it fully. And our conceptions about what that thing is, usually misconceptions, is part of it. Yeah. So it's an evolving reality. It's a self-generating reality. The more we understand, the better we can cope with it, the more sophisticated our civilization becomes. The more complicated, the more there is to understand.
What do you think is the best? I want to come to the markets and how you feel about the fact that the markets are not perfect. Well, let me go to that first.
Yeah.
You think the markets are not perfect?
Well, I think one of the misconceptions prevailing is that you know, there's such a thing, rational expectations, right. Efficient markets, and so on. I think that basically markets, it's closer to the truth to say that markets are always wrong. Yeah. Than to say that they're always right. Okay? They're not always wrong. But
yeah, it's closer to the truth. You also think there should be some regulation of markets. And while we have regulations from country to country to country, there is no regulation, in a sense, a global regulation.
No, well, see, what I put forward is that financial markets are inherently unstable. And to preserve stability, it has to be the objective of policy to introduce or to preserve stability. And in fact, we have the central banks whose job it is. We have the SEC that oversees the securities market. But we now have a global market, and we don't have global institutions. And we still need regulation. And we really have to do something.
But I should point out that the Quantum Fund is an offshore fund.
Yeah, well, I know I know what I'm speaking about.
I can tell you.
I don't mind regulation as long as it doesn't single out our fund. As long as it applies to everyone equally.
It's okay to regulate, but don't regulate offshore funds.
No, it's all right to regulate offshore funds as long as they are not singled out. You know, and particularly we are not singled out.
For reprimand or for punitive. Right, okay. Right. You would like to see some regulation of derivatives.
Yes. Yes, I think that clearly the instability in the yen showed that options can be very disruptive. They were very disruptive in the '87 crash. You know, that portfolio insurance was the use of a derivative. And it was recognized, and then so-called circuit breakers were introduced. So I think that there is a need to recognize that derivatives can be destabilizing because they bring about trend-following behavior, automatic trend-following behavior by the people who have sold the options. And when the market goes against them, they have to engage what is called dynamic hedging.
Yeah. Do you worry when you look at the Barron's Bank situation and the situation in Japan that there are throughout the world that there are these rogue traders who can cover their mistakes without being detected for a period of time?
I don't think it's anything new. I think they've been around since the 18th century, or even in the antiquity.
So is new the volume? Is that what's new? The stakes, the money?
Even maybe the size of the defaults are, because the size of the institutions is different. I think we have always had those little mishaps, and we'll continue to have them. And we have a lot of regulations and internal controls, and it's only when they break down that you have these incidents.
You are, what, 60-something, right?
65.
65. What do you want to do with the rest of your life? What is it that you hope you can accomplish? Whether you live 30 years or 5.
Yeah, you know, since I'm a believer in an open society, I think this is an open-ended question. You see,
you may change tomorrow.
No, what I mean is that I really don't know. I mean, I have a sense of direction, how far I can go. Maybe this is it. maybe I've just peaked right this minute.
Yeah, well, but I mean, but what's the opposite side of it? I mean, what is the open-ended is in terms of what you think? You don't know the answer in terms of how whatever influences you can bring to bear.
Yes, well, I really, you see, having engaged in a lot of action in the last 5 years, I'm now really entering a period of reflection. And I was focusing, let's say, on Eastern Europe. I now realize that there's something fundamentally flawed or missing in our open societies. There's
like what?
Well, there is a crisis of values and a lack of cohesion, a lack of a common purpose. And people are groping for it in different ways. And I see the need for it, but I don't know the answer. You see, I don't know. For instance, I see this tremendous need for a stable security system. I really think that we will have an awful lot of wars and
how about moral values? How about the notion of a sense of purpose?
Yes, that is very much part of
questions of liberty and freedom.
Yes, I mean the question is, you see, you live in an open society. It means that we live in a global society, multicultural. What is it that we really believe in? You know, we have our values, the Japanese have theirs. Singapore tells us that Asian values are different from American values. There has to be something, you see, that unites us, something that we stand for. And I have this rather difficult notion that what unites us is that there is the recognition that our understanding of the world in which we live is imperfect. And we have to have respect for each other's opinions. That there is a reality, but there is a pluralism of values. And that pluralism is a good thing. Now, therefore pluralism has to be the common value.
Right.
Now, how to get there? You see, we have it enshrined in our Constitution, freedom and so on. But it doesn't apply on a global scale. It only applies to our country. And it's said these things we hold self-evident. Well, it isn't self-evident. We somehow have to come to this conclusion. You see that freedom is worth preserving. That it needs to be preserved, that it won't survive without our willingness to fight for it, to make some sacrifices for it. So there has to be, let's say, a common ground for which we are willing to stand.
To stand for. Soros on Soros, staying ahead of the curve, is a conversation between George Soros and Byron Wien of Morgan Stanley. I thank you, in which it talks about philosophy and business and politics. Thank you for joining us for this time. It's been a pleasure to have you here again. We thank you for joining us. Look forward to seeing you next.
Introduced, but you stood up. You said, I don't think so. The audience started to revolt. Cap and trade failed. Now, through Freedom of Information Act, we find out that the Department of Energy and the EPA actually coordinated their response to damning reports on green jobs from Spain with the help of George Soros and his Center for American Progress, which gets their funding from here, George Soros. Here it is, December 9th, 2004. Also, there was this piece of information. This guy, where is Eli? Eli Pariser. There he is. He headed the Soros group, the front group, MoveOn.pac. Now, he wasn't upset that Kerry lost. Why? He explained this in an email. This is important that you understand. Quote, in the last year, grassroots contributors like us gave more than $300 million to the Kerry campaign and the DNC and proved that the party doesn't need corporate cash to be competitive. It's now our party. We bought it, we own it, and we're going to take it back. Do you understand what just happened? George Soros got rid of all of the corporate money through McCain-Feingold, which then allowed all the 501c3s to come in. This one might help, and this one might help, and this one might help. And all the 501c...
No imperial power, there is no balance of powers as you had during the Cold War, when you had these two superpowers sort of keeping each other in check. So you have a vacuum, a power vacuum. You have instability. And this is actually one of the main points I make in the book. This cannot last like this. We actually need an international security system. And the trouble is that the United Nations has failed just at a time when it would be most needed.
Bosnia being one perfect example.
Bosnia has been to the United Nations as Abyssinia was to the League of Nations in 1935. It showed that the League of Nations doesn't work.
Proved its impotency.
That's right. And this is an issue for us, particularly for the United States, because we created the United Nations. It's our design. We are the leading power, but we say the United Nations failed. They failed. Yeah. It's us that have decided not to.
For a number of reasons, including the fact that the rest of the world, and certainly the Western world, Japan and Europe, Bosnia being one small example, is looking to us for leadership.
Yes.
Is that just a failure of this administration or failure of a mindset in America about our role in the world?
I think it's a bipartisan issue.
Right.
I think that the Republicans have to make up their minds whether they want to support the United Nations or not. I think that, and if they don't, you know, what role are we going to play in the world?
Stay with me on that. In terms of Bosnia and what the Clinton administration has done, are you supportive because of your concern for what's happened to the children of Sarajevo?
Look, I think that we did finally. You see, when actually the survival of NATO became an issue, because NATO got involved and it lost its credibility, and for us, maintaining the credibility of NATO is what really moved us. And also to help Clinton in his re-election campaign,
because I think strong in foreign policy.
Yeah, because there was a great weakness there, so he had to do something. Well, it just once we took action, it seems to have an effect. I mean, it has moved the situation dramatically. Now, unfortunately, it happened too late, and while it is beneficial in the sense of bringing the end much closer, the damage that has been done, it cannot be undone, and we must really recognize this as a terrible failure and learn from it, because basically what we have done has been to allow the ethnic principle, the principle of ethnic cleansing, to prevail. And
whether it's practiced by the Serbs or the Croatians, or
well, actually, the real victor in this situation is Croatia, which has become a nation state with less than 2% Serb population, and there's been 180,000 Serbs that have been expelled from Croatia. Now,
with little opprobrium from the world.
Yes, and I think that that is an issue. I think that it cannot be undone now. I think it's a fact. But what kind of Croatia you're going to have is very important, and this is what we have to pay attention to.
But let me come back to the United States and what we might do. The United States, you think, began to say we have to do something different in order to rescue NATO. Right. Which was clearly ineffectual and being called into question. And we're now talking about NATO expansion.
Yes.
What can be done now, in a sense, not with respect to Bosnia, but about the future of NATO? What has to happen, and has the United States, by these actions, in a sense, recreated
Well, it has saved
a military arrangement that has no mission like it had in the Cold War.
You're putting your finger on it, because I think it has saved NATO, but the mission of NATO, what is it supposed to do, remains unclear. Is it directed at Russia? Then it means we want to turn Russia into an enemy. So I think that the mission of NATO has to be redefined.
And what might it be?
I think that that they ought to stand to protect open societies, basically, and we ought to generally, in this part of the world particularly, care about what kind of regime prevails in a country. In other words, our attitude to Russia should be different depending what kind of regime it is. Is it a democratic regime, or is it an authoritarian regime? It's not, Russia in this geopolitical chess board, that...
Well, but let me take that along. So let's assume it shifts to a totalitarian regime.
Right.
And moves away from any kind of democratic regime. Right. How should our posture towards that regime be different?
Well, I think that our posture should be different before it shifts there. In other words,
in order to promote one area or the other, one direction or the other.
That's right. I mean, we had an incredible opportunity to help that part of the world to move towards democracy. That opportunity is now greatly restricted, because it's now, we are 5-6 years into the revolution. So again, you can't go back in time. But still, we could learn from the mistakes we made in the last 5 years and still work towards strengthening democracy in that part of the world.
Was it difficult for you, because of your own experience in that area, to, over that period of years from the fall of communism and the fall of the wall and the decline of those regimes, to sit back and see opportunity and not watch, because I don't think the administrations, whether it was Bush or Clinton, seemed to know exactly what to do, and secondly, to know that they had the will of the people to do it in terms of investment?
Well, you see, I didn't sit. I actually threw everything I had into it, and I'm very satisfied having done it. I would have liked to influence policy, and I tried. I tried to get to Bush before he met Gorbachev in Malta, which I thought was the last time, really, to change the direction from the outside. I was unable to do that. So I think that I've succeeded in everything, not everything, but in most of the things that I could do on my own. And I failed in influencing the policy.
But today, Strobe Talbot is the principal, the Deputy Secretary of State, is the principal architect of our policy towards Russia. Yes?
Yes.
You have, he listens to you.
He does. He does.
So you have influence on the part of the principal policymaker, not only towards Russia, but towards Eastern Europe.
Yes.
Right?
No, I do now have access. No question. We actually work together. The country where I'm most engaged, and we are really working together, is Ukraine.
Yes.
Because there was a chance to change the direction. The country was sinking, it was disintegrating, it was failing. And a new president was elected, and for the first time, the West, under American leadership, had the wisdom to say, we will invest $4 billion if there is a reform program. So that, and now Ukraine has changed. Now, it's early days, it's very tough. I'm very engaged on working on it, and we have good working relations with the American government, with the international institutions. And I'm hopeful. Finally, in this one case, we are doing the right thing as much as one can from the outside.
When asked, is your opinion also that we ought to push forward with NATO expansion regardless of what the Russian government says?
I think it's I think that the